bury the worst nuclear disaster in human history. Engineers built the largest moving structure ever made, then slid it over the reactor like a lid on a jar.
We're losing it!
It's called the new Safe Confinement. It is rising over Chernobyl, in Ukraine, right now. A single steel arch tall enough to swallow the Statue of Liberty whole, wide enough to cover a stadium. So heavy the number sounds made up. 36,000 tons. And here's the part that makes engineers shake their heads. They built it 300 meters from the reactor. On purpose. Because building it any closer would have killed everyone doing the work. Then they picked the whole thing up, all 36,000 tons of it, and slid it, inch by inch, until it sat exactly on top of Chernobyl. This is Titan build. This is how humanity tried to bury the most dangerous ruin on Earth. And why, decades later, that ruin is back in danger. Again. To understand the arch, you have to go back to the night everything went wrong. The 26th of April, 1986. Inside reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl power plant, a safety test went catastrophically wrong. Power surged out of control in seconds. Steam pressure tore the reactor apart. The 1,000-ton concrete lid on top of the core was thrown into the air, like a coin. The explosion ripped the building open and flung burning radioactive material across the site and up into the sky. It was the worst nuclear accident the world has ever seen. Right beside the plant sat Pripyat, a modern town of nearly 50,000 people, built for the workers and their families. For a full day after the explosion, they were told almost nothing. Children played outside under a sky that was quietly poisoning them. When the order finally came, the entire city was emptied in a matter of hours. They were told they would be home in 3 days. Nobody ever moved back. Pripyat still stands today, an empty city frozen in 1986, slowly being swallowed by the forest. But the truly terrifying part was the thing you could not see. Radiation. An invisible poison pouring out of the wrecked core. So intense that standing near it for a few minutes was a death sentence. This was an enemy unlike anything in the history of construction. You cannot see radiation. You cannot smell it, or feel it, or hear it coming. A room can look perfectly clean and calm, and be quietly killing everyone standing in it. Every decision at Chernobyl, then and now, has to be made against an enemy that gives no warning at all. The first firefighters arrived not knowing what they were walking into. They fought the flames on the roof with the graphite of the reactor core glowing around their boots. Many of them were dead within weeks. Their bodies had absorbed doses no human is built to survive. And the fire was still burning, deep in the reactor, throwing poison into the wind that drifted across Europe.
Now,
the Soviet Union had to do something no one had ever done. They had to put a lid on an open, burning nuclear reactor. Over the months that followed, an army of workers was thrown at the problem. Soldiers, miners, engineers. Hundreds of thousands of them, later called the Liquidators. They worked in shifts measured in seconds. On the worst part of the roof, a man could only stay long enough to grab one shovelful of radioactive debris and run. Any longer, and the dose would ruin him. Machines died there too. Remote-controlled bulldozers and robots simply stopped working. Their electronics fried by the radiation the men were being asked to endure. And out of that desperate, poisoned scramble, they built the first cover. A hulking box of steel and concrete thrown up around the ruined reactor in about 200 days. The world called it the Sarcophagus. Nobody knows the true price the Liquidators paid. Estimates of those who died early or lived shorter and sicker lives because of what they absorbed at Chernobyl run into the tens of thousands. They built the first coffin with their own bodies. It was a coffin for a reactor, and for a while, it held. But the sarcophagus was a rush job, built in the worst conditions imaginable, by people who could not stay long enough to do it properly. The concrete was poured fast. The seams never sealed completely. It was built leaning partly on the ruined, weakened walls of the reactor building itself. It was only ever meant to last around 30 years. And 30 years is not very long when you understand what is sitting inside. because the reactor did not just break, it melted. When the core overheated, the nuclear fuel fused with sand, concrete, and metal into a glowing molten lava. That lava flowed down through the building, and then hardened into masses of some of the most radioactive material that has ever existed on this planet. The most famous piece has a name: the elephant's foot, a wrinkled black mass of solidified nuclear lava sitting in the basement. When it was found, standing next to it for 5 minutes would have delivered a fatal dose. Even years later, it was deadly. So picture the situation by the 2000s. Inside a leaking, cracking, aging concrete box, nuclear lava and fuel that would stay lethal for longer than human civilization has existed. 200 tons of it. And the box was falling apart. If the sarcophagus collapsed, it could throw a fresh cloud of radioactive dust into the air over Ukraine and Europe, all over again. Something had to be built. Something bigger. Something that would last not 30 years, but 100. And this is where the impossible engineering begins. The obvious idea is to build a new, stronger shelter right on top of the old one. But you cannot. The ground around the reactor is still contaminated. The old sarcophagus is still leaking. The radiation near it is still high enough that no crew could stand there, day after day, for the years it would take to build something huge. Send workers to build directly over the reactor, and you are back to 1986. Seconds of work, ruined health, dead men. So the engineers came up with an answer that sounds like science fiction. If you cannot build it over the reactor, build it next to the reactor, where the radiation is lower, and then move the finished building on top. Move a building, not a small one. The new Safe Confinement is an arch of steel, over 100 meters tall, more than 250 meters wide. You could stand the Statue of Liberty up inside it, and still have room above her torch. You could park a large sports stadium under it. And the whole thing weighs around 36,000 tons. They assembled it on a cleared, less contaminated patch of ground a few hundred meters to the west of the reactor. Even there, the work was governed by the invisible enemy. Every worker carried a dosimeter, a device measuring the radiation soaking into their body. When you hit your limit, you were done. Not for the day, sometimes for good. So the arch had to be built cleverly, in a way that kept humans as far from the ground and the danger as possible. They built it in 2 halves, jacking each section up into the air and adding the piece below it. So the structure grew downward from the top, rather than upward from the ground. It meant workers spent less time low down, close to the contaminated soil, and more time up in the cleaner air of the arch itself. Piece by piece, on the edge of the most poisoned landscape on Earth, the largest movable structure ever built took shape. And the arch isn't just a shell. To survive 100 years next to that much radiation, it has to protect itself. It's built as 2 skins, with a gap between them. Dry, filtered air is pumped through that gap, non-stop. Keep the steel bones dry. Because moisture means rust, and rust over a century means failure. The arch breathes filtered air forever, so it can guard its secret for as long as it takes. None of this was cheap, and none of it was done by one country alone. The confinement cost around €1.5 billion. Money from more than 40 nations, pooled together, managed by an international bank. The disaster had crossed every border in Europe. The fix, in the end, had to cross them too. And then came the part everyone had been holding their breath for. The move. The finished arch sat on 2 long tracks, like rails, leading from its assembly site straight to the reactor. The plan was to slide the entire 36,000-ton structure along those tracks and stop it in exactly the right place, covering the old sarcophagus completely. Sliding 36,000 tons of anything is hard. Sliding it to within centimeters of a target, over a ruined nuclear reactor, with no room for error, is something else. They used a system of hydraulic pushers gripping the rails and hiving the arch forward in small, controlled steps. The arch rode on skid shoes coated in a slippery, low-friction surface, letting 36,000 tons glide forward rather than grind across bare steel. not fast. A slow, deliberate crawl, watched by sensors and surveyors tracking every millimeter. A slide like this happens exactly once. There is no reversing a mistake with an object this heavy, over a target this unforgiving. In November 2016, over the course of about 2 weeks, the new Safe Confinement inched its way across the site. 327 meters. And then it stopped, sitting exactly where it needed to be, sealing the wound of Chernobyl under the largest lid ever moved by human hands. For the first time in 30 years, the ruined reactor was under a structure built to hold, not for a generation, but for a century. But the arch is not just a lid. That is the clever part. Its real job is to buy time, and to make the next impossible job possible. Sealed inside the arch, protected from wind and rain, are enormous cranes, hanging from the roof. The idea is that over the coming decades, those cranes can be operated remotely, from a safe control room, to slowly and carefully take apart the old crumbling sarcophagus, and eventually the ruined reactor itself, piece by radioactive piece. Humans cannot go in and do it. So the arch becomes a giant, sealed workshop, where machines do the deadly work while people watch from a distance. The confinement is designed to stand for 100 years. 100 years to figure out how to clean up a mess that will outlast everyone alive today. It is one of the strangest structures on the planet. Not a monument to something built, but a shield around something broken. A machine whose entire purpose is patience. Around the plant stretches the exclusion zone, a dead area roughly the size of a small country, sealed off from ordinary human life. Whole villages sit abandoned inside it. It is one of the only places on Earth that humans built, filled with life, and then had to hand back entirely to the forest and the wolves. The arch sits at the center of all that emptiness, humming quietly, doing its slow work. When it was finished, it felt like an ending. The worst nuclear disaster in history, finally sealed. A problem handed calmly to the future. And then the world did the one thing the engineers could not plan for. It went back to war. In 2022, Russian forces invaded Ukraine, and in the first hours of that war, they seized the Chernobyl site. Soldiers with guns, occupying the grounds of the worst nuclear accident in history. Some of them dug trenches and fortifications in the Red Forest, the woodland so contaminated by the original disaster that the trees had turned red and died. They were digging into poisoned earth. Reports described radiation levels around the site, spiking as the soil was disturbed. The most carefully sealed place on the planet had become a front line. And it did not stop there. Years into the war, a drone struck the new Safe Confinement itself. The arch built to protect the reactor for 100 years, hit from the sky, its outer skin torn and burning. It was a strange, modern kind of horror. A robot aircraft, flown by remote control, striking a shelter built to contain a disaster from another century. The past and the future, colliding over the same poisoned ground. The damage did not breach the reactor, but it punched a hole in something people had let themselves believe was finally safe. A structure designed to outlast war and weather and time, wounded by a weapon in war no engineer ever put in the plans. Step back and look at the whole strange story. A reactor tears itself open and poisons a continent.
Watch the left!
A generation of workers die sealing it in a coffin of concrete that was never going to last. Their children build something impossible over the top of it. An arch taller than a monument, wider than a stadium, heavier than a battleship, assembled beside the danger and then slid on top of it. A machine built not to do anything, but to wait, to hold the line for 100 years while robots pick apart the ruin inside. And then, a war arrives, and reminds everyone that even the most permanent thing humans can build is only as safe as the world around it. The elephant's foot is still down there in the dark, still lethal, still cooling by fractions of a degree over the decades. It will still be deadly long after everyone who built the arch is gone. Long after this war is history. Long after the very countries that paid for it may have changed their names. That is the timescale we are dealing with. Not a warranty. A promise across generations. The arch still stands over it, wounded but holding. And somewhere in a control room, engineers still watch the numbers. The way you might watch a sleeping animal you are not entirely sure is tame. Because Chernobyl was never really cleaned up. It was covered,
steady now,
contained,
5 degrees
put under
to the
the
left,
biggest lid the
just a
world
little.
could build.
Ready the clamps.
And the truth about a lid is
On
simple.
those lower beams.
It only works for as long as someone is willing to keep it in place. If you want more impossible structures like this one, subscribe to Titan Build. And tell me in the comments. When we bury something dangerous for 100 years, who exactly do we think is going to be watching it at the end?